for all of 2024, wild growth in this space, anywhere from like year over year from 20 to like 50%. What's interesting is headed into 2025, we saw the same numbers being posted in Q1, but we've seen a pretty rapid slowdown in terms of trends going into the back half of 2025. So those like monster numbers start to slowly tick down, and programmatic is now hovering at around like 11%. We're starting to see this market slow a bit.
You're listening to Media Monitor, where we break down what's happening in the media and the advertising industry and tell you what it actually means. John, welcome back.
Hi, how's it going?
It's good. I'm riding a little high because I checked our reviews on Spotify. I don't know if you've looked, but we've got 36 five-star reviews. People are talking.
It was exciting. I mean, it was a pretty large jump in like a week. Seems like it's catching on.
Yeah, I like it. That, and we've got a lot of news from Guideline over the last couple of weeks. And so what I was thinking we could do, considering we had a press release go out, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that last week, that a lot of folks have asked questions about, and I've heard about it up on my client calls. And so I thought it warranted us to chat a little bit about it. So what did we announce, Sean?
We announced that we have a programmatic benchmark report that we will be putting out quarterly. We kind of prepared one for Q4 as like a test, see if the clients liked it. There was pretty warm reception, so we kind of put it out there, and it seemed like overall went well enough that we wanted to announce it, that's going to be an ongoing thing. And it seems like it sparked enough interest that I had people, reach out and send me direct messages on LinkedIn, which is usually just like random spam kind of stuff. But in this particular case was like, hey, I saw this, let's talk, which I thought was interesting. And then tied to the downloads, which is like our own little unique thing, is we are now big enough of a podcast that we actually got reached out to say we could be part of an affiliate selling network where we can be listed on programmatic exchanges. And I did some math on what our cut would be relative to where we're at. I think, again, don't get too excited about this and don't try to like maybe figure out when's retirement coming. But over a 3-month period, you and I, if we did this right, could split about a penny. So
we could split something that we're not even producing anymore.
Not even producing. But if we did, you would get half of it.
Love it.
Yeah. That's, by the way, just partnership here. 50-50, right?
Hey, you know what? Last week I talked about 40 years of doing this. You gave me one. So if you're talking partnership, I'm in.
Yeah. And then honestly, by 40 years, we should probably be up to, I don't know, like $3 with inflation by that point, just raking it in.
Well, so getting back to the programmatic report.
Yes.
I figure, especially because programmatic comes up on my client calls all the time. And it's a big part and a growing part of our industry. And so I figured we should talk about what is programmatic for those who aren't as close to it, and then spend some time talking about, some high level points from the report that you produced. So just before we go into it, programmatic advertising, what is that? So it's referring to automated buying and selling of digital media, which is enabling the advertisers to transact while applying data, targeting, and optimization in near real time. So it's a way to buy that, when I always give examples at a high level, I'll say you could buy direct on, say, Sports Illustrated, or you could say, I want to target male audiences between 18 and 34. I don't care where it runs. It doesn't have to be there, and you can buy programmatically to achieve that goal. That's kind of a high level of oversimplified way that I explain it to my grandmother. You'll probably get more in depth on it, but the idea is that you're kind of focused more on an audience or a spend goal versus purchasing directly.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And again, this is probably the first of what you and I had talked about as almost a series on programmatic, because I think today we'll focus really on just the DSPs, the demand side platforms, which kind of in your example is if like I want to go out and I want to target this particular cohort at this price point with this budget, you go to one of these platforms, and folks may have heard of like DV360 Desk, right? Where you as the person buying the ads goes there and tries to see what's available, like what you can buy. We'll cover it a whole other time, but even within our data, we can also see a little bit of the supply side platform, which is on the flip side for all of the people that have these ads. They don't work directly with the DSPs. They kind of send all of the ads they have to these big platforms, SSPs, the supply side platforms. And then those two entities kind of talk to each other about like, I have this, I buy this. And so today we'll kind of just talk a little bit on your example of like, if I want to go out and buy these things, what kind of revenue are we seeing in the market today from our data? Because I think there's also then like a million different stops along the way that like once you buy the ad to ultimately once somebody sees the ad, there's not a billion, but like in some ways it feels like a billion different ways that the dollars, the impressions get sliced, diced, dissected before ultimately it lands there. And so the programmatic marketplace, for as simple as it sounds of like, I want ads, I could buy them through some sort of like web portal, is so much more infinitely complicated, like infinitely more complicated than your example of like direct. I want to buy Sports Illustrated. Cool. We have 5 ads available. Cool, I'll buy 3, right? Like in some ways it is like, it's supposed to feel like it's simpler, but it's just so wildly complex. So I think for today, maybe we could kind of highlight in our report a little bit of the activity that we've seen around, the DSP side specifically, which I think is probably a good place to start.
Yeah, and good call out as we were talking about this. We definitely see it as a multi-part series, and so we'll flag to folks who want to tune in when we're doing our part 2. But without further ado, let's jump into it and talk high level, Sean, about the trends that you're seeing in programmatic. What's happening?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is like going back over the last couple of years, we have the ability to look at this globally. So that's kind of usually where we start because it's an interesting thing in terms of our global point of view. For all of 2024, wild growth in this space, anywhere from like year over year from 20 to like 50%. And so we saw this tremendous growth happening in programmatic. What's interesting is headed into 2025, we saw the same numbers being posted in Q1, but we've seen a pretty rapid slowdown in terms of trends going into the back half of 2025. So those like monster numbers of like 43% in January, 23% in March start to slowly tick down. And, programmatic is now hovering, at around like 3% in September, 11% in August. So we're starting to see this market slow a bit in terms of what we can see from a data perspective. So that was one thing that stood out to us of like, hey, this was a bananas growth year in 24, and we're starting to see it kind of stabilize a bit going into 25. And so that was something that kind of stood out to us overall, which I think is probably two things, right? It's probably overall, we've seen kind of economic headwinds slow down ad spend. And it's also related to a lot of what we have visibility into in terms of what we can see programmatically. So the cool thing about our data is you can slice and dice it and look at it from ad type, globally. Is it a display ad? Is it a video ad? And then you can kind of get a sense vaguely of like what internally we might call like placement type, but what most people would call like streaming. Is it OTT? Is it short form network like a YouTube? You can see that across all of our countries. In some of our entities, you can see super more granular than that, but high level, what we know is a lot of our programmatic data we have visibility into ultimately goes to some sort of streaming product or maybe a connected TV product. And that's actually an area where we've started to see some kind of maturation and slowdown as kind of there isn't this huge explosion this year of a brand new player coming in and announcing ads like they did with Amazon last year in terms of how Amazon scaled. Netflix was a couple years before that. So that was helping fuel a lot of the growth. Now that kind of all the global players have some sort of ad supported format, it's now about like that, 5, more rhythmic growth, kind of maybe 10%. So that's a big part of why we're seeing essentially the slowdown in our data, economic headwinds and maturation of the market.
And I guess maybe also growth off of a bigger base from 2024 is harder to achieve, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So, within programmatic, you've talked about ad types. Are there certain ad types that are pacing ahead of others, or certain categories where things are pacing ahead that are worth calling out?
Yeah, yeah. I think there's some interesting kind of pieces globally that we're seeing. Is number one from a category perspective. Basically, 3 and 4 of the categories we look at increased programmatic spend. So it is still growing, and it's also a place where there's overwhelming more growth than there is cuts. But categories like telco, so think of like a T-Mobile globally, or I guess Deutsche Telekom globally, but T-Mobile in the U.S. Insurance across kind of home, auto are all seeing pretty strong growth. And then also what folks might call, fast food, we would call quick service restaurants. The McDonald's, the Burger King of the world have all, pretty significantly shifted dollars and I guess pounds in many cases into programmatic. But telco is the high end, up 61%, and then on the low end of that spectrum is QSR, quick serve restaurants, still up almost 20% year over year. So like some pretty big swings there. On the flip side, though, it's not all growth. We are seeing some categories start to kind of pull back. Credit cards is down 15%. Alcohol's down 7. Toys and games cut down pretty heavily, almost down 40%. And it's a mixed bag, right? Alcohol overall, we're just seeing less consumption. And so as a result, less revenue going in. So budgets are getting cut, particularly around advertising. With toys and games, globally, a lot of that is just tied to tariffs and economic headwinds, that it was a lot harder to move that stuff globally. And so there was less people buying it. And so I think kind of a combination of both, again, economic headwinds and very specific category dynamics. There are a handful of categories that are not opting to move more into programmatic, which is, again, kind of a bit of a unique tale here. The other thing I should mention, which is also a lot of what's fueling programmatic, that again, because we work with agencies, we get agency data, we don't necessarily have line of sight into this, but programmatic is very popular for like small brands who maybe don't have an agency but want to kind of book their own advertising. Many
Right.
times they will do that programmatically. So we don't necessarily see that, right? We're seeing the big brand spend, but that is a big part of why programmatic overall is growing pretty healthfully.
And in terms of, the share of programmatic versus direct, how is that e evolving, and what did that look like in 2025? And kind of where do we see that going?
Yeah, so it's kind of stuck in 2025, which I was genuinely a little surprised about. I would expect, given programmatic's growth, direct's kind of tapering off. You'd expect kind of every month or every quarter it to kind of slowly climb up in terms of share. But essentially for all of 25, we've kind of seen it hold in at around that 30%. Again, maybe 1% up or 1% below in a given month. But basically for every $100 being spent in the market, 30 is being transacted through programmatically, and then $70 is still going through your, Sports Illustrated example, where someone's going to the publisher and saying, "I want to buy your ad." Publisher going, "Great, cool. Let's exchange some dollars." So like interestingly, it is kind of stuck. Now again, that's up from 27% a couple of years ago, but 27 to like 30 is really not that big of a jump relative to the growth that we saw of like 14, 18%, throughout kind of all of 24. And again, maybe it's because 25 isn't growing as fast, but it is kind of just hovering in that kind of about a third is programmatic.
What is your prediction for 2026? Do you think it's gonna continue hovering, or do you see any shifts happening?
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? On the CTV space, essentially, if you stripped out programmatic globally, CTV would be more or less down. And within that subset, really streaming. So kind of taking aside the YouTubes of the world for a second. Basically, all of the growth in streaming in our data came from programmatic in 25. So I would expect actually programmatic then to kind of start to claw up this year, given so much of that growth on streaming is coming from the programmatic space. If you told me by the end of 26 it was like 33%, 34%, I would believe you. If you told me it stayed at 30, I would actually be pretty surprised.
Okay, so you're anticipating a change. Now, I want to get a little more granular here, and this is where we may need to define some things. But like you mentioned at the top of the call, there's lots of permutations of how you can buy, and within buying, there's a few different kind of like tactics you can take. You can buy in what's called an open marketplace. You can buy in programmatic guaranteed, and private marketplaces. There's a bunch of different ways that you can buy. I'd love to hear a little bit about what that looks like if we kind of go a level down. What are the
Yeah.
trends there?
Yeah. So kind of two things to call out there is one, we do want to say that whereas the rest of the stuff we talked about was really a global trend, this in-depth look around kind of the deal type of like how it's flowing through programmatic is really something we only offer in the US today in terms of the really kind of granular kind of cuts of the data. So from a kind of how we're looking at it, there's something called like a PMP, which is like a private marketplace. That's a publisher is going to take their inventory, they're going to put it to the side, and they're going to invite brands or agencies in and say, only you who we invite in can bid on this programmatically, but bid on it. So it's kind of this reserved inventory. It's often done for maybe like higher value events. Maybe it's kind of like unique titles to that platform. An exclusive. So that is like roughly, let's call it about 30% of what we can see in terms of our inventory for 25. There's also a programmatic kind of guarantee where it's not necessarily in a kind of programmatic marketplace, but if you buy a certain amount of ads from us, we'll guarantee a certain price, we'll guarantee a certain volume, right? There's all sorts of guarantees, but it's kind of this give-get exchange in terms of what we can see. And that kind of is around, let's call it a little less than, 17, about 16%. Overwhelmingly, what we can see in our data is a lot of the stuff we see from an open marketplace is that's where a lot of it's transacted. So about half of what we can see. An open market is anybody can buy and sell in these spaces. It's often bundled, so it doesn't necessarily go to one network. It's often what might be called like remnant inventory, things kind of left over after the better, kind of stuff gets sold. And then in those cases, you're really just saying like, I need to reach these people. I want the lowest possible CPM. Here's my budget. Go out and find them whenever we can kind of get there. And that's where we see a lot of the movement. But it's something that we're also exploring and opening up in other countries. But for right now, it's just available in the US.
Gotcha. So private marketplace is members only, programmatic guarantee. You kind of like signed a lease and reserve some space, and then open marketplace is Craigslist, for lack
Pretty
of
much.
a better term.
Yeah. Or yeah.
Okay. Well, I think let's pause here because that was a lot already. And I
A
think
lot of numbers.
a lot of numbers, a lot of industry buzzwords. So one of the things I wanted to do was invite folks to reach out to us and see where we should go next with our programmatic coverage, because there's a lot of angles we can take. So please give us a shout. Our contact is in our various channels, but we're looking for feedback. We want to hear what you want to hear, and we'll bring it to you on our next installment of our programmatic series.
Yeah, and as a plug too, I would also be curious of like, keep going on the global, individual countries, very kind of curious to hear more there as well. So very much open to the feedback, as Kelly said. So,
all right, Sean, as always, a wealth of knowledge, and thank you for your time today.
It's been real. I'll see you in a week.
All right, bye.
Bye. That's Media Monitor. Follow us and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts every Wednesday for a new episode. And as always, thanks for listening.